this was the fear, that those dangerous black men would rape white women. And so this reinforced and fed the logic and the cycle of stigma and violence directed towards black people. The justification for the lynching problem, that becomes a problem in terms of the progressive establishment in this country. The NAACP is founded explicitly in 1910 to take on the problem of lynching and racial violence and its potential to move to the north. Those same people were fairly ambivalent about lynching in the South when it stayed in the South. But when it moved north, they started to say, well, this is not who we are. And if Northerners are starting to want to lynch black people, we've got to do something about this. That's the glib take on the foundations of the NAACP. But here's the kicker. The framework in which all this information is understood is drawing on two mythologies, and they're corollaries of each other. One mythology is that the evidence of higher arrests of black people in places like Chicago and Philadelphia, which were some of the first places where such data was kept. Again, when police officers made arrests, they didn't necessarily take down racial demographic data. They took down the age, the name, a description, but we had to grow into this need to keep track of race, because when you have 90% population enslaved, you don't need to keep track of that kind of thing. So that's new. And so local crime reporting agencies did keep track of race in the early days, post-slavery. So Chicago and Philadelphia were some of the first cities to keep track of it. That data was available, and so people used it until more came online. And it turns out that the arrest rates in Chicago and Philadelphia were through the roofs compared to Birmingham or Jackson. Now, any social scientist here, and I don't want to get caught up too much in this, is the law of small numbers. Small numbers can produce big outcomes, big disproportion. So, but that's not part of the analysis. All that these people turn to is that Chicago and Philadelphia have higher rates of arrest of newly arrived black folk, or those who have been there, compared to the South. And as Northerners, we know that we are free of the taint of racism. We know that we are colorblind. We have just sacrificed our sons in the name of freedom to free the slaves. We have the tradition of the abolition movement. We are building our capacity to do new work on behalf of the ex-slave. We have sent missionaries down to schools to help build those 3,000 schools and universities, the Spelmans, the Fists, the any number of one-room shacks that became the places where black people first learned how to read. That's our legacy as Northerners. So if our experts are telling us that black people are committing more crime in our midst, that's a reflection of something wrong with them. Even if they were ambivalent about these allegations of black rapists running around the South, even if it made them uncomfortable to feel that there maybe was a problem, but they weren't going to co-sign on the Southerners' point of view just so easily. But in reference to the North, well, if that's what the statistics say, then that's not about us. And so the myth of Southern exceptionalism is born out of this moment. This notion that racism resides in a Southern region, in a Southern body, is actually furthered by the production of this statistical knowledge. Really. So we know this culturally as the arrival of the birth of a nation, as this moment of great reconciliation between the North and the South on what really happened after slavery. That the criminal black man took over the state legislatures in the South, was so free to chase after and to give physical manifestation to their desires of white women, and which is the basis of the actual narrative arc of the film Birth of a Nation, G.W. Griffith's first blockbuster Hollywood success. This is the same film that Woodrow Wilson is showing in the White House as truth-telling, as the real story. A professional historian, former Princeton president, comes the progressive president of the United States. And as a side note, when Precious came out a few years ago, Barbara Bush had watch parties in Texas because this was truth-telling about the state of black parenting and illiteracy today. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. So the myth of Southern exceptionalism is a form of narrative that essentially grows out of this moment, but it's all tied back to that number. Remember the story of progress? So the North is wedded to this story of progress. It's wedded to the story that is an uncomplicated, simplistic view of the sacrifices it made and what it made possible for Black people. It is unwilling to wrestle with the contradictions in its own backyard and the evidence of a growing problem of apartheid in the North. Now, we sit here at the long train of a long line of scholarship and history and journalistic assessment and redlining in Detroit. We know the story, but I'd like to tell you what we know now and what Black folks were living then. But that wasn't the story. That wasn't what kids were taught. And so even in the language of this moment, you have people, and I'm just going to use him because he's an easy foil, but he's representative of this moment. You have in this moment people like Booker T. Washington who speak to this problem as evidence that Black folk didn't belong in the North, that when they went North, they got into trouble. And they need to stay their behinds in the South, where they would learn how to be frugal, hardworking, moral, build character using their hands, and stop worrying about what white people are doing. Now, we could take issue with that. That's fine. He's a complicated man. But he does embody a certain kind of renouncing the counter-narrative, the project of the counter-narrative, and a kind of reluctance to educate young people in that moment to what is actually happening real-time with the establishment of Jim Crow. That was the project that Du Bois set out to do. That is what he set his pen to the work of. What Carter G. Woodson said, studying Negro life in the service of challenging and fixing it. Booker T. Washington was not interested in that project. He was interested, in a good way, of giving people lifelong professional development skills, like those motivational speakers who say no more excuses. I mean, you get in where you fit in, right? Certain messages work with certain people. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, but there is a cost to renouncing the political and social analysis. There was a cost in Booker T. Washington's day to supporting a critique of what this was. So, Du Bois, one of the foremost architects of the use of crime statistics, the person who I argue in condemnation, essentially gave us our framework for what we make of crime statistics and how we use it as a society, and particularly the political purposes of racial control and punishment, is a man named Frederick Hoffman. And what I want you to see in this slide is, and I'll explain the picture in just a moment. This project for him was not an isolation from the project of European immigrant settlement in this country. So remember the Second Industrial Revolution, the problem of the displacement of poor white people, evidenced by the symptoms of struggle and strain, suicide, crime, insanity. Well, that was a set of major issues that gave birth to a group of people we call progressives, who set out to use the best tools of social sciences to document the problem and to proffer solutions. Hoffman was a major source of that knowledge base. He was the first person to provide macro suicide statistics to the nation. Literally. Nobody was interested in it in America. It was happening in Europe. People like Durkheim were coming from Europe and influencing the establishment of sociology. This was all brand new stuff. You could be a really enterprising, innovative, smart person and make a huge difference during this time period. And so Hoffman was that person. Interestingly, he also was a paid actuarial. He was the main chief actuary at Prudential Life Insurance, headquartered in Newark, New Jersey, where they are headquartered to this day. Interesting line of work for a person who would have such influence and power over what we think about racial crime statistics. Well, anyway, the point is that Frederick Hoffman made claims about what we should make of Black people's criminality in direct relationship to European immigrants. He wanted us to essentially know that European immigrants were okay because Black people were the real threat to modern society. And statistics were the proof. start to sound familiar? Does it start to explain a little bit of our collective stories about the immigrants who came here, suffered nativist attacks, but worked hard, were ambitious, saved their money, and made the American dream real, and black people didn't want to work, had bad morals, and essentially are responsible for their own fate? A 2009 Washington University poll of people who identified as members of the Tea Party compared to those who identified as opposing the Tea Party. Washington University's Institute for the Study of Race wanted to come up with a way. I told you have to be very inventive to get folks to admit they're racist. So this inventive methodology was essentially to ask people who self-identified as Tea Party a couple of questions, and the questions themselves they associated with racist points of view, with those who identified as opposed to, in opposition to the Tea Party. So here was the question, and you've heard this question before, some of you. If black people would only work as hard as the immigrants did, would we eliminate racial inequality in America? If black people would only work as hard as the immigrants did, would we see the end of racial inequality? Now, if you were a member of the Tea Party, when asked that question by these pollsters, you answered that question, yes, 88%. So, of those polled, 88% agreed with that statement. That's the smoking gun, right? Because those who are sophisticated in studying race in society know that's not true, because they know the story of European immigrant assimilation. They know what was made possible for European immigrants that was not made possible for black people, including redlining. Again, short circuit, a more complicated conversation to make the point. If you were white, by the 1940s, you could move in nice houses, in nice neighborhoods, and the government would underwrite the cost of the building of your home and the mortgage payment at 90%. If you were black, no can do. So that reality, they know, but the people they're asking don't know that. Some do, some don't. So 88% agree Tea Party. Those who oppose the Tea Party, and this is what should trouble us, those who oppose the Tea Party agree 56%. Which means that one of our grand simplifications in this country, one of the reflections of our historical illiteracy, is that we think the story of immigrant assimilation is a simple story of, what do they say, what the motivational speakers say? Success is when preparation meets opportunity. Right? So when preparation meets opportunity, you get what you deserve, success. And that's our collective memory of the experience of European immigrants. Well, Hoffman tells us something differently. We're all trained as postmodernists, so we know how to read closely. Well, he says, the Irish and the Italians show a percentage of arrests decidedly above the average. So if you stop there, like in our Second Amendment interpretation, right? We parse the clauses and we get to where we want it. We just stop there. We say, oh, well, the Italians and Irish are troublemakers. They're dangerous, right? They're above the average of the native-born white American. But his point is not to malign them, although he does use their statistics of whatever, of their violence or crime, however we want to define it, as evidence that there's something wrong with society. This many white folks are getting into trouble or they're killing themselves, which is the final part of this discussion I'll get to. Yet small when compared with that of the colored element. Hoffman was creating the space for us to pay attention to black people for the purposes of building our capacity to survey, to use surveillance and social control against them, which, consistent with his progressive politics, was to open up resources for European immigrants. There was a trade-off. There was an explicit moment, a decision to use crime statistics. So let's hold this constant, because this is where we are in the world today. We're going to have high rates of crime and violence. We can split the difference as to which one's really higher and which one's smaller. But let's just say there's a lot of people who are suffering, and there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of bloodshed, and a lot of people who look like the other person are killing themselves, right? They're killing themselves, they're killing someone that looks like them. Homicide has always been mostly an intraracial thing. You kill people. First of all, most people who shoot somebody or stab someone is someone they know.